The wind cut sharp across the wide valley, carrying with it the smell of wood smoke and the distant sound of a wolf's lonely cry. Snow clung to the ridges of the mountains like white scars, and the land stretched out raw and untamed, the kind of place where only the stubborn or the desperate dared to stay. It was the late 1800s, and life in the frontier was not for the faint of heart. Here, survival was not promised. It was earned each dawn with calloused hands, an empty belly, and a prayer whispered into the cold night air. Out on the edge of this wilderness, a woman stood, her face pale, her breath rising in small, ragged clouds. Her coat hung open, revealing the heavy swell of her stomach. She cradled it, as if holding the whole of her fragile future inside, and her eyes searched the rough cabin door as though it might hold an answer. Her boots were thin and worn through at the toes, mud clinging to the seams. She looked as though the mountains themselves had wrung her dry hair tangled, cheeks hollowed, spirit nearly broken. When her voice finally cracked the silence, it carried all the weight of her suffering. "My baby and I will be starving out here," she cried, the words trembling as they left her lips, carried off by the icy wind. From the doorway, a man stood with his hand against the frame, half in shadow, half caught in the warm glow of the lantern behind him. He was large, his shoulders broad beneath a long coat worn smooth at the elbows. His beard was thick, streaked with the dirt and frost of a life spent among the peaks. His eyes, though hard and weary, carried something else, something gentler, buried deep, like a coal still glowing in ashes. He was a mountain man, one who knew the land's cruelty better than anyone, and for years he had lived apart from the world of others. But now, standing before this trembling woman, felt the old walls around him shift. The woman pressed a hand against her back and winced as another wave of pain rippled through her. She had been walking for miles, every step heavier than the last, every breath filled with fear that her body might give out before she found shelter. She had no kin left, no husband by her side, and no promise of safety. What she had was hunger gnawing at her belly and the weight of a child that would not wait for spring to ease the ground. She looked at the man as if he were the last post of fence in a broken field, something to cling to before. The wide nothing swallowed her whole. The mountain man studied her, his jaw tight, as if he was measuring more than her words. He saw how her dress clung to her frame, threadbare, and how her hands shook not only from the cold, but from weakness. His first thought was that she would not survive a week out there alone. Not in this wilderness, where the snow could bury a soul overnight, and hunger could strip the fight from anyone, and no matter how strong. His second thought, the one he did not want, was that if he let her stay, his quiet world would never be the same again. For years, he had kept to himself, living off the land, trapping, hunting, and trading just enough pelts in town to keep a roof overhead. He had no use for company, no desire for the burdens people brought with them. Yet something in the woman's plea rattled him. It wasn't only her voice, it was the life she carried within her. A life that hadn't yet been touched by the world's cruelty. That, more than her trembling hands or hollow eyes, made his chest tighten in a way he hadn't felt in years. The lantern light flickered, casting long shadows along the cabin's log walls. The woman swayed, her strength failing, and pressed her palm to the door as though she might collapse if he refused her. The man's hand clenched at his side. He could turn her away, leave her to the night, and the mountains would swallow her like they had swallowed so many before. He knew it. She knew it. And still, he hesitated. She whispered again, softer now, her voice breaking. "Please, I have nowhere else to go." The silence stretched, heavy as the snow-laden clouds above. The man's eyes darted past her to the dark ridge beyond, where wolves would soon prowl, and the thought of her stumbling out there with the child inside her gnawed at his gut. The fire in his cabin cracked faintly, calling him back to the warmth, to safety, to solitude. But something stronger than habit pressed against him now. The woman's knees buckled slightly. Her hand flew to her belly as if the child stirred, demanding its own voice in the plea. For the first time in years, the mountain man stepped forward, reaching out, his shadow falling over her like a blanket. And yet even as he moved to catch her, A question burned in his mind, one he could not silence. Taking her in meant more than food and fire. It meant risk. It meant surrendering the peace he had fought so hard to keep. It meant the possibility that her troubles might soon become his own. The mountains waited in silence, as if holding their breath, the cold pressing in from all sides. The woman's eyes met his, wide with fear and hope tangled together, and the night seemed to hang suspended, balanced on what he would do next. The answer hung unspoken in the icy air, waiting for the moment when choice would give way to fate. The man's hand closed gently, but firmly around her arm before she could crumple to the frozen earth. He steadied her, the strength in his grip reminding her she was no longer completely at the mercy of the wild. She drew in a shivering breath, the smell of smoke and pine drifting out from the cabin, as if beckoning her toward warmth. For a long moment, they both stood in silence, the mountain wind tugging at her hair. The lantern flickering between them until he finally stepped back and gave a small, wordless nod. The door swung wider. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of burning wood and old leather. The glow of the fire painted the cabin's rough walls in gold, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and bend like restless spirits. She entered slowly, clutching her belly with both hands, eyes darting from the stacked logs near the hearth to the iron pot simmering faintly. Her lips parted as if the simple sight of hot food was almost too much to bear. The man closed the door behind her with a thud that shut out the howling night. He moved across the room with the ease of someone who belonged to this place, pulling a chair toward the fire. His movements were spare, efficient, as if words were not needed where action would do. She lowered herself onto the chair with a wince, pressing her hands against the swell of her child as though to remind it that safety had, for now, been found. But safety was a fragile thing in those mountains. The woman knew it. The man knew it too. Hunger had a way of finding cracks in every life out there, and winter always took more than it gave. As she sat, she found herself studying the cabin. It was built for survival, not comfort. A rough bed in the corner covered with furs, shelves lined with jars and tools, a rifle leaning within reach. Everything spoke of a man who lived by necessity, not want. She wondered if he had built it with his own hands, cutting each log, sealing each gap, stacking his solitude higher with every beam. The man placed a bowl before her. The steam rose in curling wisps, carrying the scent of venison stew. She stared down at it, her throat tightening as though she might weep over the mere sight of food. Her hands trembled as she lifted the spoon, the first bite burning her tongue, but warming her all the way down. "You walked far," the man said finally, his voice deep and rough, carrying the weight of disuse. She nodded. "Too far." Her words cracked like dry twigs. She did not tell him about the nights she had spent sleeping beneath trees, the days her body screamed for bread that wasn't there, the way fear had sat beside her like an unshakable companion. She didn't need to. Her hollow cheeks and swollen belly told enough of that story. The man watched her quietly, his eyes lingering on the child she carried. "You won't last out there," he said. It wasn't a question, only a truth spoken aloud. She lowered the spoon, her gaze fixed on the fire. "I know." The silence stretched again, filled only by the crackle of the logs. The woman shifted uneasily, the weight of the child pressing against her ribs. "I didn't mean to come this far," she whispered. "But I couldn't stay. I couldn't." Her voice faltered. She gripped the edge of the chair, steadying herself against memory she dared not name. I had to keep moving. The mountain man didn't press her. He'd learned long ago that people's pasts were like the wilderness itself, some paths were best left untrodden. He only gave a slow nod, as if to say he understood more than his silence revealed. Yet his thoughts churned. He had chosen this life apart for a reason. The mountains asked for all of a man, and he had given himself fully, trading the clamor of towns and people for the company of storms and stone. But now here was this woman, heavy with child, bringing a world of need into his cabin. The fire popped loudly, startling her. She glanced toward the door as though half expecting it to open again, though by whom she did not know. The man caught the flicker of fear in her eyes. Whoever she had left behind, it had not been by choice alone. Outside, The wind howled like a restless beast, rattling the cabin walls. The woman shivered, though the flames licked high in the hearth. She thought of the long nights ahead, the endless dark that wrapped these mountains in silence. Could she truly survive them? Could her child? The man leaned against the table, arms crossed, studying her with the guarded look of someone weighing risks. "The winter's long," he said at last, "and I don't take to company." Her heart sank at his words, though he had not turned her out. She set the spoon down carefully, her hunger still unsatisfied, but her pride refusing to beg. Her voice trembled, but she met his gaze. "I'll work. I'll do whatever I can. I won't be a burden." For the first time, something softened in his face. He saw not just a desperate woman, but someone still clinging, however faintly, to her will to fight. He said nothing more, only moved toward the fire. Adding another log, the flames flared high, their light flickering across the cabin walls, catching on the steel of the rifle, on the jars of dried berries, on the axe leaning against the door. Shadows stretched long, and in them lay questions neither dared speak. Who was she running from? What would it cost him to let her stay? The woman's eyes fluttered with exhaustion. Every part of her body ached from the road, and yet fear kept her upright, her hands clenched against her swollen belly. She could not allow herself to rest fully. Not until she knew what this man truly meant to her survival. He turned from the fire, his gaze heavy on her again, as though he were still deciding what place she would take in his world. The weight of that silence pressed between them like the mountains outside, immense, unmoving, filled with secrets. And then, as if summoned by their unspoken thoughts, a sound cut through the night, distant at first, then clearer. A howl, long and low, answered by another. Wolves. The woman's hand flew instinctively to her stomach, her breath catching. The man's eyes flicked toward the door, his jaw tightening. The wild did not care for human fears or fragile hopes. It demanded strength, and it tested every weakness. For a moment, neither spoke. The firelight danced, the wolves called again, and the night closed in tighter around the cabin. Whatever path had brought her here was not finished. The danger that lived beyond those walls was waiting, and perhaps it was closer than either of them wished to believe. The woman's eyes met the man's once more, and in that look lay a question neither dared to voice. Would he protect her? Or would the wilderness take both her and the child before the spring thaw? The wolves howled again, nearer now, their cries carrying through the frozen night. The man moved to the rifle without a word, his face set, his mind already working through possibilities. The woman clutched her belly tighter, her heart pounding as though the child inside her could already sense the storm gathering at their door. The fire cracked. The shadows leaned closer, and the cabin seemed to hold its breath. Waiting for what would come next, the rifle rested across his knees as he sat in silence. Eyes locked on the cabin door, as if he could see straight through the thick wood into the dark woods beyond. The woman had finished her stew, but she did not feel full. Hunger like hers had a way of clinging, even after warmth touched the belly. She sat stiffly, her hands wrapped around her child as though she might shield it from the cries of the wolves outside. The man's face was hard, but his mind was restless. Wolves rarely came so close unless food was scarce. Winter had been cruel that year, the snows deeper, the game thinner. He knew what hungry wolves were capable of. But the sound of their howls also stirred an older memory in him when he had tried to bury beneath years of solitude. He remembered another winter, another night when he had failed to protect someone. That failure had driven him higher into the mountains, far from towns, far from voices that reminded him of what he had lost. Now here was this woman, heavy with a child, sitting at his fire as though the past had returned in another shape. The woman studied him quietly, searching his face for something she could trust. She did not yet know this man's name, nor he hers. Their silence carried more weight than words could have managed. But she could not keep silence forever. "Will they come close?" she asked finally, her voice little more than a whisper. His gaze flicked to her. "If they smell weakness," he said. Her arms tightened around her belly. "Then they'll come." The fire popped, and shadows leapt along the logs of the cabin. She felt the warmth against her face, but the cold of his words pressed deeper. She wanted to ask him why he lived out here alone. What sort of life had driven him into the teeth of the wilderness, but she bit her tongue. Some questions, she knew, were not safe to ask. She had her own secrets, after all. Outside, the wolves howled again, closer now. She drew a shuddering breath, but before fear could take full hold, the man rose to his feet and crossed to the small window cut into the wall. He peered out, his broad frame blocking what little light the lantern gave. After a long pause, he spoke in that steady, unyielding tone. "They'll keep their distance." For now, her body sagged with relief, though her heart still thudded like a hammer in her chest. The firelight painted his features in sharp relief, and she caught sight of a scar that cut across his jaw, half hidden by his beard. He looked like a man carved from the mountains themselves, weathered but unbroken. Hours stretched on. She shifted often in the chair, each movement sending a dull ache through her back. The child inside her stirred as though restless too. She whispered soft words, words meant only for the little one. Though she caught the man glancing her way as though he'd heard, the night deepened. The cabin wrapped in silence save for the occasional crackle of firewood. But in the stillness, questions gnawed at them both. For her, it was the fear of what lay behind her face as she had fled, hands that would not release her even when she begged. For him, it was the memory of a life broken. The reason he had vowed never again to let another soul depend on him. The woman dared to speak once more, her words trembling. "You've lived here long?" He did not answer at first. His eyes remained on the flames, as though reading something there only he could see. Finally, he gave a small nod. "Long enough? Long enough for what?" He looked at her then, and for a heartbeat she wished she hadn't asked. His gaze was heavy, burdened with stories untold. "Long enough to know what the mountains take," he said. Her lips parted, but no words came. She looked away, the truth of his answer pressing on her chest like a weight. She knew about loss too, though in a different way. That knowledge was what had driven her from the place she once called home. The fire began to sink low, embers glowing deep red. The man stood again, feeding it another log, the sparks flying up like fleeting stars. "You can take the bed," he said. His voice rough but not unkind. Her first instinct was to refuse, to say she could not take the only bed from him. But her body betrayed her, aching for rest, begging for relief. She rose slowly, every movement heavy, and lowered herself onto the furs. They smelled faintly of smoke and pine, of long winters endured. She curled onto her side, one hand resting against her belly. Her eyes fluttering closed, though fear still clung to her. He sat back down, the rifle near at hand, his back to the fire. He would not sleep that night. Not with wolves close, not with a stranger in his home. His eyes stayed open, watching the door, listening to every creak, every gust of wind, every distant cry. As the woman drifted into uneasy sleep, her mind replayed the days that had brought her here. She saw again the faces of men who had once sworn to protect her but turned to cruelty instead. She remembered the long road she had taken alone, each mile heavy with fear. And she remembered the night she realized there was no turning back. She had to run, for herself, for the child. She had to keep moving until the mountains swallowed her whole or delivered her into something new. Sleep did not bring peace. She dreamed of chasing footsteps behind her, shadows that reached out with grasping hands, of voices calling her name in anger. She stirred restlessly, murmuring words she did not mean to speak aloud. The man, sitting by the fire, caught fragments, pleas, cries, warnings. His brow furrowed, though he did not rouse her. Whatever haunted her belonged to her past, and in time, he suspected, the mountains would force the truth from her. The night dragged on, its cold pressing against the cabin walls like a living thing. The wolves grew silent, but silence did not mean safety. Sometimes it meant only that danger had drawn closer. The man kept his rifle ready, ears tuned to the smallest sound. He told himself it was habit, nothing more. Yet part of him knew that his watch was no longer for himself alone. Dawn came slow, light creeping through the cracks in the logs. The woman stirred awake, her body sore but grateful for the rest. She sat up, blinking against the dim gray light. The man was already at the door, pulling it open to survey the land. Frost covered the ground, and far off he could see the faint tracks of wolves winding back into the trees. "They'll be back," he muttered. More to himself than her, she pushed herself up, steadying against the wall. "Then what do we do?" His jaw tightened. "We endure." It was the only answer he could give. It was the only one the mountains ever allowed. She watched him step out into the cold, his figure strong against the vast, empty land. Something inside her whispered that this man was more than a recluse, more than the hard shell he showed. But what he truly was, and what he would become for her and her child, remained hidden. Waiting in the long shadow of the mountains, behind them both, unspoken and unseen, loomed the greater danger. Not just the wolves circling the cabin, not just the hunger of winter, but the past that hunted her and the memories that haunted him. The true test had not yet come. But already the air felt heavy with its approach. The child within her kicked once, sharp reminder that time would not wait, that choices would soon have to be made. She pressed her hand to her stomach and closed her eyes for just a moment, whispering a promise that no matter what came, she would not stop fighting. The man looked out at the mountains, their peaks sharp against the pale sky. His grip tightened on the rifle. He had told himself he wanted no part of the world beyond these walls, but now, whether he liked it or not, it had come to him. And he knew the wilderness would soon demand an answer for both of them. The days that followed carried a strange rhythm, like two lives stumbling to find a way to fit together in the small, rough-hewn cabin. The woman rose each morning with aches in her back, pressing her hands against the swell of her belly as though the child inside her was pushing harder to meet the world. The man always rose earlier, his boots already laced, the door cracked open to the frost-laden dawn. He never spoke much, but his actions said enough. He returned with firewood stacked on his shoulder. With hares caught in traps, with water frozen at the edges of the bucket, he hauled from the stream. For a time, the silence between them became its own language. She cooked what little food he brought, adding herbs she found near the cabin when the snow allowed. He patched the walls against the wind, tightened the door where it sagged, checked the rifle with a steady, practiced hand. Yet beneath the simple rhythm, tension coiled tighter with each passing day. The wolves did not leave. Their cries echoed through the valley at night, closer, circling, testing. Sometimes she swore she heard their claws scratching against the cabin logs, though the man only shook his head and said nothing. The silence was worse than any words, for it told her what he would not admit, that the wild was pressing in, and their small fire might not be enough to hold it back. But it wasn't only the wolves that gnawed at her peace. She often caught herself glancing over her shoulder, certain that the life she had fled might still be chasing her through the mountains. At times when the man's back was turned, she thought she saw figures moving against the snow, shadows that vanished when she blinked. She told herself it was fear, nothing more. Yet deep down she knew that people, unlike wolves, did not always give up their hunt so easily. One night, when the fire burned low, she stirred from uneasy sleep and found the man still awake, sitting by the door with the rifle balanced across his knees. His eyes were open, staring into the darkness, as though he were listening for something just beyond the edge of sound. She sat up, her blanket falling to her lap, and whispered, "You don't trust the night." He didn't look at her, only gave a faint shake of his head. The night don't care about trust. She wanted to ask him why he lived this way, why he had chosen the loneliness of the mountains, but the words caught in her throat. He was like the trees outside, silent, rooted, bearing scars of storms she could not see. Still, she felt the pull of his presence, the way he carried strength without ever speaking of it. The days grew shorter, the nights heavier. Snow fell in thick sheets, burying the land in white silence. Food grew scarce. The man set traps farther and farther from the cabin, sometimes gone for hours that stretched into near nightfall. She worried each time he left, pacing the small space with her hand against her belly, whispering to the child that he would come back, that the world outside had not swallowed him whole. One evening, as the wind howled like a living thing, the man returned with his shoulders hunched and his face pale beneath his beard. His coat was torn near the arm, and she saw the smear of blood dark against the fabric. Fear surged in her chest as she rushed to him. What happened? Wolf, he muttered, brushing past her as though it were nothing. But the stiffness in his movements betrayed him. He lowered himself into the chair, the rifle set carefully against the wall, tugged at the coat until the wound revealed itself, a ragged bite, deep and angry. Her breath caught. You should have told me sooner? He scowled faintly. No time for weakness. She tore strips from an old shirt, dipping them in warm water from the kettle, her hands trembling as she pressed them to his wound. He hissed between his teeth but did not pull away. As she worked, their eyes met, and in that moment she felt the wall around him falter, just a crack. He was not invincible. The mountain man bled, and for all his strength, he too could be broken. As she bound the wound, she whispered, "If you hadn't come back?" Her voice trailed off, heavy with the weight of what might have been. He looked at her then, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. For a heartbeat, the silence between them was filled not with fear, but with something sharper, something that made her heart thrum. But just as quickly he looked away, and the wall returned. The wound slowed him in the days that followed. His movements grew slower, his breath heavier when he lifted wood or carried the traps. She took on more cooking, mending, even braving the snow to gather what dry branches she could. The child inside her seemed to sense the change, moving restlessly at night as though mirroring her unease. Then, one morning, she saw them. Tracks in the snow outside the cabin, too large to be wolves, too straight to be deer. Human tracks leading from the ridge down toward the cabin, stopping just at the tree line. Her stomach knotted. She didn't tell him at first, afraid of what his answer might be. But the fear weighed heavy until she finally confessed. He studied the tracks in silence, his face unreadable. At last he said, "Someone's looking." Her heart pounded. For me, he didn't ask why. He didn't need to. The way her voice shook, the way her eyes darted to the horizon, he understood enough. His silence was an answer in itself. That night the cabin felt smaller than ever. The shadows stretching long, the wind rattling the door as though eager to break it down. The woman lay awake, her hand on her belly, listening to the steady sound of his breathing beside the fire. Every creak of the logs, every whisper of the wind made her flinch. Somewhere out there, someone was watching, and sooner or later, they would come closer. The wolves returned, their cries mingling with the storm. For the first time she could not tell whether it was the beasts or the men she feared more. She turned her face toward the fire, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. The child inside her kicked hard, as if reminding her that time was slipping away. Days blurred together, marked by hunger, by fear, by the endless gray sky pressing down on the valley. The man's wound healed slowly, but it left him weaker than before. He spent more time staring at the horizon, his rifle always close. She knew he was waiting, listening, preparing for what neither of them wanted to name. One evening, as dusk bled into night, she spotted movement near the ridge. A figure, just for a moment, standing against the snow. She froze, her breath catching, her hand gripping the edge of the window frame. By the time she blinked, the figure was gone. But the truth was plain. They were no longer alone. When she told him, his face hardened. He loaded the rifle with slow, deliberate care, the click of the metal echoing through the cabin. "It's coming," he said simply. Her chest tightened. "What will we do?" He looked at her then, the firelight catching in his eyes. "We endure." But endurance, she knew, might not be enough. Not against the hunger of wolves, not against the men who hunted her, not against the weight of a child that could arrive at any moment, leaving her too weak to flee, too fragile to fight. That night, the storm rose with a fury that shook the cabin walls. Snow slammed against the logs, the wind howled like the voices of the dead. And through it all came the sound she had dreaded most, a sharp knock against the door. Her heart leaped into her throat. The man rose, rifle in hand, his body tense, every muscle braced. The knock came again, louder, insistent, as though whoever stood outside would not wait much longer. The woman clutched her belly, her breath ragged. The child moved inside her, pressing hard against her ribs, as though it too felt the danger. The man's hand tightened on the rifle, his eyes flicking toward her just once before fixing on the door. The firelight danced wildly across the walls, shadows leaping like restless spirits. Another knock, this time a voice calling through the storm. The words were muffled, but the tone was sharp, commanding. The woman's blood ran cold. She knew that voice. The man stepped closer to the door, his finger brushing the trigger. The silence between heartbeats stretched thin as glass. The storm screamed around them. The wolves howled in the distance. And inside the cabin, the air held tight, waiting for the moment when the fragile line between survival and ruin would finally snap. The storm howled so loud it seemed the mountains themselves were roaring. But inside the cabin, the sound of the knock pressed heavier than the wind. The voice outside carried through the cracks in the door again, sharper this time, and the woman's breath caught. She knew it. A voice from the life she had fled, from the fear that had chased her across the frozen land. Her hands tightened around her belly, her body trembling as though the child itself recoiled from the sound. The mountain man's eyes never left the door. He stood tall, rifle steady, his presence filling the small space. His silence told her everything he had heard, enough in her broken words on that first night to know that whoever waited outside was no friend. His gaze shifted just long enough to meet hers, and though no words passed, she understood what he was asking. Could she face what had come? Could she carry the truth into the firelight and not turn away? The knock came again, then fists pounding harder. Snow blew in through the cracks, a cold mist filling the room. The man's voice outside demanded shelter, claimed he had tracked her here, called her by a name she had not heard spoken aloud since the day she ran. Her heart thundered, every syllable a knife slicing through the fragile peace. She had known by the cabin's fire. Her voice broke as she whispered, "Don't open it, please." The mountain man nodded once, firm and final. He shifted the rifle, the wood of the stock steady against his shoulder, his finger brushing the trigger, but not pulling. For a long moment, time seemed to hold its breath. Then the pounding stopped. Silence fell, broken only by the storm screaming against the walls. But silence was not safety. They both knew the men outside would not simply leave. They would circle the cabin, waiting for weakness, the way wolves circled prey. The mountain man moved to the window, lifting the shutter just enough to see the faint outlines of figures in the snow, dark shapes against the white. His jaw tightened. They're not going anywhere. The woman clutched her belly, feeling the sharp pain that rippled through her. Fear mixed with something else. Her time was closer than she had allowed herself to admit. She whispered to the child, her words trembling, "Hold on. Just hold on a little longer." Through the night, the men outside prowled, their voices carrying through the wind, taunts and threats thrown against the cabin walls. The mountain man answered none of them. He stoked the fire, kept the rifle near, and watched the door like a hawk. Each time the woman stirred, wincing from pain, his eyes flicked to her. Concern etched in his otherwise unshakable face. At dawn, the storm eased. Snow lay thick and heavy across the ground, muting the world into silence. The man eased the door open just a crack, enough to see what waited. Footprints circled the cabin like a trap. No bodies remained, but the tracks told the truth. The men had only stepped back, waiting for their chance. He shut the door, bolting it firm. "They'll come again," he said. His voice was flat, steady, as though he were stating the weather. The woman nodded, her face pale, her body shifting uneasily with the child pressing hard against her ribs. She had no strength left for denial. The past had found her, and the mountains were no longer wide enough to hide her from it. Days passed with a tension so thick, it hung in every corner of the cabin. The man set traps closer, wary of straying too far. The woman worked beside him as much as her strength allowed, though every hour brought new aches and sharp pains. The wolves kept their distance, but the silence in the valley felt unnatural, as though both beast and man were waiting for the same moment. One evening, as the sun sank low behind the ridges, the first cry of her labor tore through the cabin. She gripped the edge of the bed, her breath ragged, sweat beading on her brow despite the cold. The mountain man's eyes widened, but he moved without hesitation. He stoked the fire higher, brought what clean cloths he had, set water to warm. His hands were rough, built for wood and rifle. Not for this, but he stayed at her side, steady as stone. The night stretched long, every hour heavy with pain and fear. Outside, shadows moved. Voices drifted closer, but none dared yet press against the door. Inside, her cries mingled with the crackle of the fire.
Eyes.
And the mountain man's voice, deep and steady, urging her to hold on. His hands caught hers when she faltered, his eyes locked on hers as though he could bear some of the weight himself. At last, with the storm rising again outside, the child's cry filled the cabin. Thin, sharp, alive, the woman collapsed back against the furs, tears streaking her cheeks, her arms reaching to gather the small, fragile life against her chest. The baby's cries echoed louder than the wind, louder than the wolves, louder than the men who waited outside. It was the sound of life defying the cold, defying hunger, defying fear. The mountain man stood close, his face softened in the firelight. For a long moment, he said nothing, watching the woman cradle her child. Then, with quiet certainty, he spoke. "They won't take you now, not him, not you." But even as the words left his mouth, the sharp crack of footsteps on frozen snow broke through the night. The men had returned, drawn by the sound, by the proof that life had kindled in the cabin. The mountain man's jaw set, his hand closing around the rifle. He moved to the door, every step filled with the weight of a choice he had long sworn never to make again. The woman's voice called after him, weak but firm, "Don't let them in." He looked back at her, at the child nestled in her arms. And for the first time since she had arrived, his face carried no shadow of doubt. He nodded once. Then he stepped into the storm. The world outside was white and silent, save for the figures standing in the snow, their shapes hard and dark against the pale sky. They called out, demanding he give her over, promising the kind of mercy that men who hunt the weak never carry. He lifted the rifle, his voice low but steady, carrying across the frozen ground. Not here. Not now. What followed was a clash the mountains themselves seemed to hold in silence. Words turned to shouts, shouts turned to violence, and in the end, the wolves themselves answered the noise, their howls rising as if the wilderness had chosen its side. When the door finally swung open again, the mountain man returned. His coat was torn, his face pale with exhaustion, but his eyes were steady. He set the rifle aside, leaned against the wall, and for the first time in years, let himself breathe deep. The danger had passed. Not gone forever, but enough for the night. Enough for the woman and her child to rest in peace. The woman looked at him, at her eyes wet with gratitude, her arms tight around the baby. No words passed between them, but in the firelight, something unspoken bound them together. Two lives once broken, now tied by the fight they had shared. Winter stretched on. But the valley no longer felt like a place of silence. The cries of the child filled the cabin, soft and insistent, a reminder that life could grow even in the harshest ground. The woman grew stronger with each passing day, her fear loosening as the walls of the cabin became more than shelter. They became home. The mountain man found himself watching them often, the walls he had built within himself slowly crumbling. He had thought solitude was his only way to endure, but now he saw a different kind of strength in the life before him. The child's cries, the woman's quiet smile, the warmth of their presence by the fire, it was all a reminder of what he had once lost, and what he had now found again by the time spring crept back into the valley. The snow melting into rushing streams, the wolves gone to higher ground. The cabin no longer stood as a fortress against the world. It was something more. It was a place where hunger had been beaten back, where fear had been faced, where life had begun anew. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the ridges, the woman stepped outside with the child in her arms. The air smelled of pine and earth, fresh and alive. She looked at the mountains, vast and unyielding, and whispered a promise to the little one pressed against her chest. "You'll never starve. Not here. Not with us." Behind her, the mountain man stood in the doorway, his hand resting against the frame, his eyes on her and the child. He said nothing, but his steady presence spoke louder than words. The wilderness had tested them. The past had hunted them, but together they had endured. And in the heart of the mountains, where the wind carved stories into stone and the nights carried the cries of wolves, a new story had begun, one of survival, of trust, and of a life no storm could take away.